We've started off our morning already with deep conversation with a lot of our workshop participants sharing what resonates with deeply personal stories they bring to these issue areas. And as you can imagine, that session went over time just a little bit. But we are very pleased to have this portion of our day be more public-facing so that we can share some of our framing thoughts, insights, with our broader community, with the thought of who do we bring in beyond this workshop. So I am deeply pleased to be introducing this panel discussion. For those who are unfamiliar with the space and who I am, I'm Yila Rasul. I'm Director of Planetary Politics here at New America. And for those who are joining us virtually, this is our opportunity to have a conversation that goes beyond the problem itself. I think we all recognize, even though there are many who won't admit it, what the problem is. I think we have a fair sense or a sketch of what potential solutions are like, but it's the messy middle that we're hoping to contend with that we believe is essential for getting us to those potential solutions. So we are hosting today at New America a workshop on mapping the political economy of a just energy transition. As we face the perils of climate change, there's growing recognition that we need a green transition. There are a lot of positives to that, but it also comes with a lot of potential pitfalls, especially for those communities that are on the front lines and are facing these challenges in real time. So I won't take much more time and just immediately introduce our distinguished panel here. Immediately to my left here, I am joined by Camila Camilo, who is the founder and executive director of Creators Academy in Brazil. And next to her is Tegan Blaine, Dr. Tegan Blaine, who I had the privilege of working with when I was at USAID, and we took some fun field trips in Ghana to look at eroding coastlines. Dr. Blaine is currently the Director for Climate, Environment, and Conflict at the U.S. Institute for Peace. And next to her, we are very thrilled that Hope Akuthe is joining us from Nairobi. She is a project officer for the Africa Energy Access and Transition and Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. So we'll have this conversation somewhat truncated in kind of two parts. What I want to start with is just a framing of the problem itself. I just heard today that we're already facing 1.5 this year. Since the Paris Agreement in 2015, the 1.5 Celsius threshold has been held up as we can't get there, and yet we are almost there. So life is already changing for people. But what will life look like in a 2C world, in a 3C world? And what is life already looking like for especially those vulnerable communities in this 1.5C world? So I'll turn to you, Tegan, first, and then over to our other colleagues.
Thanks so much, Sheila. It's great to be here. I think that my two colleagues here are going to focus more on energy systems, but what I'd like to talk about at first is the connection between climate and conflict and what that means for the world in which we live. You know, for the last couple of years, I've been working on better understanding how things that we cared about when we were at USAID, like food insecurity and water insecurity, even health insecurity, translate into community-wide impacts and what it means when you are seeing individuals and families affected by climate change and how that affects their own security, but then it has cumulative impacts. One of the things that I worry about most is the decisions that people make when they are facing personal insecurity or insecurity of their families. And what we're beginning to see is that people can't make decisions that are very productive in that space. The recruitment to armed and extremist groups, for example, is being driven by individual insecurity. Some of the work that the UN has been doing in this space on why people end up joining armed and extremist groups shows that significant percentages of people who are facing food insecurity are more likely to join groups like that. And so that's an example of where climate change is impacting people's decisions to look for security wherever they can find it. And working with armed and extremist groups are a way that perhaps there are promises that their families will be fed or that they will have access to water. It's also a way for people to gain purpose when they are facing a loss of their livelihood and of their identity. And that's impacting areas that are cross-border areas. It's not unique to a particular area, but we're seeing armed and extremist groups being significant influences across borders. Another issue that we're facing is both voluntary and involuntary displacement. There's already a lot of discussion about how weather emergencies lead to involuntary displacement, but also people are being driven to look for livelihood options wherever they can. And if they can't stay at home any longer, those people who are capable of moving will move to look for options. Some of that is temporary, they'll go and come back. Some of it allows them to provide for people at home through sending back money or other resources to support the people who are left at home. But this is also beginning to impact, how cities grow, for example. We're beginning to see transportation corridors where people are moving more regularly with all of the follow-on impacts of those kinds of things as well. And we really need to start thinking about how both temporary and permanent displacement is being driven by climate change and will affect conflict in the pathways that people are taking in many of the urban or peri-urban areas where they're ending up, and what life looks like as well for the people who are left behind, either because they don't have the resources to move or because they've chosen to try to stay in an area when other people are leaving. But another issue that I worry about is how the response to climate change or the lack of a response to climate change undermines trust in government. When people are facing difficulties, they expect a government to help them. And when that doesn't happen, it undermines trust in government and has the potential to lead to significant political instability, potentially in ways that can turn violent. And so how do we deal with governments that perhaps are not equipped to deal with the changes that we're facing and can't respond adequately? How do we deal with people's expectations? And what does that mean when their expectations fail in terms of their trust in government and how that might result in, undermining of elections, undermining of the services that governments are capable of providing, and so on. So these are some major factors that I'm worried about. How climate change is beginning to drive people to violent and extremist groups, how we see it turning into, movements of people, both voluntary and involuntary, and also how it's contributing to greater political fragility and how governments do and don't respond to climate change.
That's important, and thank you for that, because it leads me to my next question over to Hope. How do you see this playing out in your community in particular, and what kind of brought you to this space, and what do you think is missing from this conversation?
Okay, currently what we are seeing is the frontline communities that we are working with are the hardest hit by climate change, and unfortunately we are also the least resilient to climate change. And then there's a component that we didn't cause this, but we are suffering the most. So when we come in with the concept of just transition, I think it needs to be contextualized, because for us in Africa, the main problem is access. I mean, the figures are mind-boggling. 600 million with no access to basic electricity. That means just simply lighting and charging your gadgets. 600 million people, and over 900 million do not have access to clean cooking energy. Those are mind-boggling figures. So we are at crossroads, when we talk about energy transition. Some ask, is it just energy transition or just energy transition, So where do we start? Where do we do it? And there is also a push, do we leapfrog or do we transition gradually? So some of these issues are a little bit complex and we need to contextualize. I know the situation, the energy transition movement started from the labor movement, but in Africa it doesn't make sense to use that approach. So we just need to see, first of all, can we have access to that energy and also build resilience to the effects of climate change, because we cannot ignore that in terms of infrastructure, in terms of affecting livelihoods, food security. It's a whole myriad of issues that even lead to conflict, that lead to migration, displacement. So we need to deal with some of these issues, contextualize it with the regions and deal with it step by step in that way.
Thank you for that, and I think I would love to touch on that in a little bit too, but Camila, especially as a youth activist and one who's trying to help change the narrative around climate action, what do you see as missing from these overarching global conversations on climate and then just energy transition, or energy transition and the just part of it as well?
Well, for me, thank you for having me. It's really an honor. I think we are dealing with like two major aspects. One is language. In the language aspect, it's not just about changing the narrative or tell more stories. It's which story we are telling. Who are the storytellers? Are we bridging stories from different economies and contexts, or we are picking the stories that is more comfortable to us to deal with, and letting the others people that are impacted by the climate crisis just live that way. And the other aspect is when we talk about resilience, right? Resilience for developing countries could be many things. When it comes to Brazil, our energy matrix is considered like a clean one. 87% of our energy matrix is from like renewable. Even I'm saying that like hydroelectric power is not that good for some communities, right? But it's considering in the emission aspect is a clean one. But are we really listening to the communities? And one thing that comes to me is, can we find ways to bridge these conversations? Just last week, I was experiencing something like that. I was in the Amazon sharing an AI tool for forest conservation. And it was so cool to see how indigenous youth can use technology, like high-level technology. I was saying that like we are helping them use a conservation assistant that was created using ChatGPT, for example. And one thing that we noticed was they were more willing to talk with the AI assistant than have a conversation with a foreign visitor, because their relationship with people has caused them trauma. But technology, it's in my phone. This is my data. If I talk to someone, like if I talk to the machine, this is my information. So I think when it comes to systemic trust, we need to build a way to make sure that the conversation is really trustful for the both sides. I think technology is a way to do that. But the other side is like, are we really able to, get out of our offices, go to the frontline communities, stay in the field for a while, experience their experience. When I try to invite people to come with me to the forest, it's like, just stay away from your phone and your references, what climate means to you, and go see what the forest is today, And sometimes, and maybe my hypothesis is, if you go to the place, probably you fall in love with the nature again. You know, like I think the decision makers, they forgot to fall in love with nature. So if you don't care about something, like if you don't love something, you'll not be able to care about it. You won't find the ways, tools, technology, information, science behind, because you're just focused on the numbers, on the statistics, right? So I think when it comes to a story, we can bridge by experience. I think we need to combine, of course, scientific information, but literally body experience. I've been seeing people, they are so traumatized. Like, this summer in Brazil has raining a lot, so a lot of communities has facing floods. And the For You TikTok timeline, you know, was like full of videos of kids less than 10 years crying because they can't go outside to play because there's floods everywhere. They lost everything. They don't know. And some of the parents are saying, oh, you need to pray. You need to go to God and ask them for, like, but it's not God's fault, you know? Like, climate always change. But the fathers, the parents, they don't have the information to tell the kids what things is going this way or not. But the kids, they are feeling the trauma is staying in their bodies, is literally stealing their childhood. So I think we can offer, especially to schools and IPLCs, technology to help them keep their stories alive, and also keep us on track when we think to find solutions without listening to them. And I think we need to find a way to simplify our questions, because sometimes we do very complex questions to those communities, and they think, like, they're very smart and they're very thoughtful, but the way they build thoughts is just different. The structure is just different than us. So maybe it's our job to create the bridge to combine their thoughts and ours. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Camila. And now slightly transitioning, didn't mean to do that, to the energy transition itself. I mean, you know, so often we're given technology as the solve for everything. The technology will fix it. But with, you know, let's focus on renewables in particular, it has its own dirty side and sort of complications that come along with it. So actually, Tegan, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little more about the unethical side of the green transition and what it means for especially those communities that are on the front lines of extracting the resources that we need for these clean technologies.
Is it okay if I tell a quick story?
Please.
Many years ago, when I was at USAID, 10 years ago, I was in Nairobi with a variety of people working on climate change across the continent. And we intended to go out to a new wind tower that was being put in place to see the technology. And then later that week, we were scheduled to go out to a geothermal facility because Kenya's really been in the leadership on implementation of geothermal. As we went out to the wind tower outside of Nairobi, our vehicle was stopped. There was a community throwing rocks at our vehicles. And eventually the US government driver made the decision that it wasn't safe to proceed and turned around. And I had been so excited to see the technology, and I didn't know what was going on and why there was actually unrest around there. Started to figure it out. And then later that week, we went out to this geothermal facility. It was incredible to see some of the technologies. And then we spent some time talking to the communities around the geothermal facility. Again, people were not happy that it was there. And it boiled down to some of the same issues, that many people who had lived in these areas did not have clear land rights, for example. And the Kenyan government just steamrolled over people's use of the land, many communities of whom depended on this land for agriculture, for production of food for their families, and basically were just shoved aside. The geothermal facility had promised that benefits would flow to the local communities in terms of clean water and other opportunities when they were pushed aside. Never delivered. That's an example of one of the really tough aspects of this. When we're thinking about technologies, we think wind energy, geothermal energy. These are great opportunities to increase the supply of electricity, but we're not thinking about how it's done. And not only that, but then, at least in many of these communities, these utility-grade utilities are taking the electricity away. You know, people are seeing the electricity being generated in their communities, transmitted to Nairobi and beyond, and aren't even benefiting from that. We see similar stories when we're talking about mining of green minerals and all of the issues around mining that are related to human rights abuses, pollution, land rights issues, and an enormous amount of stuff there. So it's easy to get fixated on the technologies. The technologies are developing so fast and in stunning ways. But the pathway to implementation and how we balance the needs of communities against the opportunities that green energy presents is something that is far more deserving of the amount of attention we're currently giving it.
Thank you for that. And hope, you know, given the work that you're doing, especially the Pan-African perspective, there are a lot of competing beliefs on what energy transition looks like for sub-Saharan Africa in particular, but also in the global south writ large. These competing interests are, you know, there's the spread of the narrative that it's unfair, clearly so, that it's the global south that is the lowest emitter of these carbon emissions that have led to climate change are now responsible and bearing the brunt of it. And they're the ones who are expected to transition very quickly and can't focus on their own economic development. And then there's the other narrative that, you know, we have these technologies, there is the potential for leapfrogging fossil fuels. How do those kind of dissenting views kind of come into play, and how do you see it as like the path forward?
Okay, I can say we are at some form of a crossroads because on one hand, the whole of Africa has accounts for like less than 3% of global carbon emissions, and we have not exhausted the carbon budget, as we call it. Like the North has, you know, like consumed like 85%. So there's that argument that why can't we use up our global carbon budget? The North has developed. We are yet to develop. So why can't we use whatever we have? And many countries are now discovering their fossil fuel deposits. There's oil, gas everywhere, all around, and then the critical minerals are being discovered. So there's a feeling of why can't we use? After all, we have not emitted much. But on the other hand, we are told, no, don't make the mistakes that the West made. So leapfrog and leave this out. So we are there wondering, like, you know, what do we do? And some governments are actually defiant and saying, forget about what the North is pushing, that's their agenda. There's even some people in the narrative that say renewable energy is just a way of marketing something. But we know that renewable energy would be, you know, like would really help. And we, of course, we acknowledge that renewables are not entirely, you know, emission free. But there are less, you know, emissions in that, and we need to embrace that. So we need to put our house in order also and prioritize and see what works for us, and not at the pace. There's the actual push, you know, like you need to go this way, you need to go this way. And we know some people have their own agenda in pushing this, but I think we should be allowed to transition at our pace. There's also the general thought that why don't we use gas as a transition fuel and gradually move from fossil fuels? So One thing that we need to also demonstrate is the use of, some people would say like renewables will not work for industrialization, and we are looking at industrialization. So what technologies can we adopt? And some governments say, no, we need to use, we need to still use our fossil fuels to industrialize. So we are at crossroads in that area. But countries like Kenya have renewable energy sources. I think it's almost 80% renewable. We have geothermal and other sources, but it's still not accessible to that. So we also need to factor in, even as we are looking at the push for renewables, is it affordable? Is it accessible? Is it reliable for us? Because we are still looking at development, and we have a future, 50% of the population is the young people, so we still have a future ahead of us to grow. So we need to look at that and also convince our governments, how we can develop, because there are also those economies like Nigeria that rely on fossil fuels for their income. So we need to work on that if renewables is to be adopted fully by the governments. But Kenya is doing great. Kenya is doing quite a bit and is an example to many of the countries. So some of this, unfortunately, some of the resources that we have do not benefit. That's the sad bit of it. Fossil fuels, most of the deposits like oil, gas, leave the continent. They are mined there, they leave the continent. So they have no benefit to the continent. So if we can, as I said earlier, put our house in order, see how we can harness some of these things. The critical minerals she was talking about, can we have our processing within the continent instead of them being extracted, processed elsewhere, and then we come and import them at higher cost to the detriment of the economy. So we are at crossroads, and some critical decisions need to be made, and many questions are asked. But I feel that we should not push or castigate people for not wholesomely embracing. Let's give it time. Will the gradual transition work for us, or, is there a way of demonstrating that leapfrogging will work for us?
And just kind of pulling on a thread that you just shared is kind of the notion that, climate action is very much this Western, white-dominated area in space. And so, Camila, especially given that a lot of the critical minerals needed for renewables are also in Latin America, like, how can we remove the colonial and neo-colonial meaning or framing from governance of these resources?
Yeah, well, big question, I think this whole room, we're thinking a little bit about it. So first of all, one thing it comes to me is this narrative around global north and global south just is not working. It's just like us and them, and and geographically speaking, just is not right at all, because when it comes to the global south, we have a lot of countries that geographically in the south, but they have resources. They are doing their work right. So geopolitics speaking, we talk a lot about sovereignty, right? But sovereignty is something that is probably a privilege of developed economies, right? So how the G7, G20 can support the other developing economies to actually do things that are good for their countries. When it comes to colonial perspective, we still have countries that pay tributes to other countries around the colonial era. So recognize that is the first step. Like, are we really willing to change? But we didn't change as a humankind the conversation around colonialism, because we are talking about, like, form some colonies in Mars, right? So like the thinking of extract, the thinking of make the other service continue really embed in our humanity. So like this is the issue as a society we need to address. We don't respect the others as the same as us. Like this is the issue. When it comes to Latin America, I think as a Brazilian, for very long, I thought like, let's just consume other countries' culture and products because everything we do is not good enough. This is the type of mindset that is like really is really inside of people in Latin America. Now we kind of are finding our ways, like pop music, we are able to, explore some products too, but we are not exporting geopolitical thinking. We are not taking place on the globalization conversation. We are most like, okay, let's serve the global leaders and try to find ways to survive in this environment. And countries like Brazil is always being the good developing economy. We are always like so welcome. We are always like just mediating conversations. Those that try to be a little bit more revolutionary, they might be sanctioned sometimes. And I'm not telling that it's like we need to deal or make easy for dictatorship. I'm not saying that. But I need to say that like when some countries think about their own sovereignty, the developed economies, they immediately stop their relationships. We are not organizing rooms for conversations that are uncomfortable. And I think the solution for that, like, of course, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but it's the way we do the diplomacy, I was in COP spaces, and it was like, it was so hard to understand what is happening there. Like, I've been there for 3 years, and I'm still getting, like, what is happening in these spaces. So, like, but one thing that I noticed, it's like, just one word can mean so many different things. And I noticed, like, from my own country, sometimes our negotiators wasn't able to catch what was happening in the room, So, like, are we willing to change for a really truthful diplomacy, or we still telling words that are empty in their meaning, but actually the worst thing that I heard on COP, like during the negotiations, was like every time someone was blocking something on the text, was like, this is not in our mandate. And I was like, what do your mandate means? Like, and are we able, or we are able to challenge ourselves to make our mandates really oriented to work and action and results? Because it's easy, ask each other, people deliver the results we need, right? I've been seeing this with my corporate clients. Sometimes they are investing millions of dollars on marketing campaign and a couple thousands in the impact project. But they ask so much about from the impact projects, so the marketing team can use the results for their reputation. We need to shift to where the money is going so we can communicate real action. I think this is the issue, and I think Latin America can lead this way. Brazil can be a leader. Political issues might complicate things, especially the relationship in the region. But I think we can collaborate. Like, we just need more rooms like that, like this one we are today, where people can really speak about their personal conflicts, like leading with the whole situation, and put aside the whole background behind, and understand like how we can build things together. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I think that's so important, and hopefully something we can talk about today is how do you, especially in these diplomatic negotiations and engagement, to create this space for radical thinking, because the problem is here. It's not in the far off future, and so we need radical thinking and radical approaches to take care of it. I realize that we're slightly over time, but I know that we have one question coming from our virtual audience. How to prevent the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure in developing countries without infringing on their desire and need for energy access? I pose this to you all, but I'm also looking very closely at Hope.
Thank you for that question. And this issue of justice, I mean, it really comes in strongly, even as we're advocating for energy transition. We look at it like it's beyond just compensating or looking at the rights of workers. We are looking at, she talked about a classic example of this land where people are coming with great ideas. We are coming with this whole new wind farm. But what about the people who live there? Is there justice? As we are talking about it, are the people hurting or is it benefiting them? So we need to consider whatever works, if it is a solution. And the reality is like, from the wind farms, she says, you see power lines leaving that community and moving into elsewhere, and yet they are unable to access that. So our governments need to come up with, be open-minded, but there are deep-seated issues that even hindered some of them from even caring or bothering about these communities. So we need quite a lot of decentralized energy solutions, especially in the rural communities where the regular infrastructure is hard to reach and could be costly because of population. So the energy utility may not invest in a sparsely populated area. So when we have a decentralized solution that works, but then consider the poverty levels. Is it affordable? Are they able to access it? Currently we have, I'd call it cheap in quotes, technology coming in from countries, and within 6 months to a year, the solar lamp is out of order, cannot work. Then what next? Do we throw it away? And how do I come back and convince this person that you need to use this technology instead of using a kerosene lamp? Then he tells you, but I bought this and it is quite expensive. But I'm glad there are private companies that have come up with easy solutions. They have pay-go solutions. So or communities can come together maybe as groups. The social grouping is quite strong, especially in the rural communities. So they come up with community groups, then pool resources and are able to access some of these things. So some private companies have tapped into that. They have this pay-as-you-go system. So you pay, then when you don't pay, you don't get the electricity. And then they give you at lower interest rates. So that is quite friendly. So when we have such solutions, it will help. And they are able to see the benefits. So if it is something about clean cooking and it is biogas and it is accessible, because at the bottom of it all is accessibility, affordability, and reliability. So when you have these three factors, whatever technology is there is embraced, then we can talk about a just transition. But if it's going to harm the overall community, it doesn't make sense to them, because as she said, you'll come and they'll say, we don't see what this thing is benefiting us. Yes, the government is talking about we have gone renewable, we have all this great technology, but if the local communities are not benefiting, then it doesn't make sense. So when we have those factors, I think it will, and it is something that people are ready to embrace if you're able to demonstrate that we can get them quality products, not just substandard products, because at the end of the day, again, we are accumulating waste. Where do you go with all this technology, with us?
No, that's a very important point, and I know we've also talked about this extensively behind the scenes, but I also want to give opportunity to our in-person audience for any questions that they might want to ask of the panel. I don't know if there's a microphone that's floating around, but if anybody has a question, if there's no microphone, I'm happy to relay it. Please go ahead.
I would love to hear the...
Oh, I'm sorry, there's a microphone coming, my apologies.
Thank you. So I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts a little bit on the idea of climate reparations. So one of the key challenges, I think, is that, as Hope pointed out, the global north is responsible for the vast majority of the emissions that currently exist. And something I think we need to consider more is how not to follow, kind of a green imperialism, but to instead think about a green just future. And I think, I'm just curious, what role might climate reparations play in that, and what could those look like? Because, some people argue it's just a transfer of funds, but also it could be transfers of technology and other forms of opportunity that might help address some of the leapfrogging challenges that you were bringing up in your earlier discussion. Thank you.
Who wants to talk about it?
Okay, I can just share something about reparations. We've had discussions on that, and there are some people who look at reparations in terms of the North needs to pay for what they have done. And then we have been, in some forums, we have been told there is no way you're going to pay. Others will ask, how do you quantify the damage? How do you quantify all these things? Are you attributing all the natural calamities that are happening to climate change? So it's interesting that you brought up that idea that it could be in the form of technology. Yes, there are brilliant ideas coming up from various institutions around there, which needs to be harnessed. But one shortcoming I've seen is like most governments do not invest so much in technology. So there's a lot of knowledge lying in our universities. People have brilliant ideas that the governments are not willing to fund. So most of the time we find someone comes up with a brilliant idea, and the next thing you hear that this person is in Germany or in the US or in the UK. They seem to see the advantages more than we need to do. So we need to, we can adopt that. And then another challenge is in terms of loans and commitments. We are looking at, can we have more concessional loans rather than, there have been offers of, we'll give you money in form of insurance. How does that work? How do I quantify my cows? There are people who have animals and they're pastoralists. How do we quantify that when we lose your animals because of extreme weather events? So it hurts. It really hurts when it comes to in terms of financing, because again, we get the finances most of the time in foreign currency, in dollars, and then we consume it in our local currency. We have to pay back in foreign currency, and inflation and the currency values now have really gone down. A year ago in Kenya, $1 was at 100, about 120 shillings. Currently, it is now 160 shillings. So by the time the country is thinking of repaying the loan, the exchange rate has really gone up. So it means that the country has to sacrifice some of the social development issues. Instead of investing in health, we take that money to pay back a loan, which is really not helping. So it's quite a cycle. And then in terms of technology, some of it may come from other parties, but somebody has patented his knowledge. It's taken all that time. Is he willing to, share some of these things? So if our governments can invest in research and development more heavily, I believe we can move somewhere. We can grow. I like that idea of technology as a form of reparation. But in terms of actual compensation, that's a difficult one. It's difficult. Many countries would not accept, because you'll say, how would I quantify the payment that I'm paying you back? And then somebody will argue, I've had, extreme weather events here in the US, there are floods, there are, droughts happening in Europe. So where does that leave us, So we need to come up. I still strongly believe as a continent we have potential, but I wouldn't want to say we are lazy, but we need to tap into that potential and do things, what we can do on our own, and stop actually crying. We've been really crying for a long time. Can we do things? We have our local solutions, so can we start doing things our way? Other than, I know we can't blame people forever. We can't. So we need to start working on our own.
I think that, we haven't even had the opportunity to touch on the financing question, but I know that's a huge one.
Yeah.
But we are almost out of time, so I just want to give just a few seconds to each one of you for some closing thoughts, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. I was thinking on the reparation question, and I like to think that we need to shift guilt for responsibility. And as soon as we use the language that make people feel attacked, there's another issue. So to address climate change in a way that'll be good for the IPOCs or any local or urban community, we need to take responsibility, right? What our companies are doing, why the communication strategies is so focused on the individual actions and not on the systemic actions or the company issues, why our legislation is so hard on people and so easygoing for companies. This is the conversation, right? Like, I was following Davos conversations, and 200 CEOs say, 200 billionaires say, you can tax me more. But the thing is, the system don't work for tax you. You're saying that because probably it took 20 years to change the whole economic system until someone be able to charge you in your billions of fortune. So I think we'll take courage and a little bit of, how can I say this without being like, we'll take some, we need to be humble and recognize who we are and how bad our actions is as like economies and companies. And this comes to the biggest challenge for me, which is leadership. Like, we can talk about technology, we can talk about economic systems, but at the end of the day, we're talking about people. We need to change people. How we can do this? Like, we need to change people's minds and hearts, and then they will change the organizations and the systems. And this is the hardest work to do because it needs a lot of time that we don't have anymore. So we need to build rooms full of people that are willing to work with other people, not just convince them that the topic is important, but make them understand the future impact of actions. Like the shareholders, they're just concerned about the next quarter. We need to talk with board members that like, your next quarter results is not better than the future of the next generations, right? So like, I think more of us need to be in boardrooms, make those shareholders understand the challenges, because unfortunately, the solutions will follow where the money is.
I think all of us are orienting a little bit towards this reparations questions, and that's where my thinking is as well for an ending comment here. Dr. Maxine Burkett, who is a professor of law at the University of Hawaii and is now with the administration, has done quite a bit of thinking and writing about reconciliation in the context of climate change and where reparations fit into that. And, I think that is a field really worth exploring quite a bit more, because we've already discussed today some of the psychological burden of climate change that we're all facing and that future generations will face. And so I think that there's a real role for thinking about reconciliation in this process in a way that allows people to move beyond some of the issues around political will, around finance, and which, regardless of our own individual postures on flows of finance, there isn't political will at the moment. And so how do we continue to maintain innovation and energy to work on these issues when faced with that lack of political will? How do we continue to explore innovative finance approaches that I'm sure some people in this room are working on? But also, how do we think about finance in this larger realm of what might be needed in terms of reconciliation and forgiving each other for the role that we've played in our own individual countries in creating this world of climate change, and then how do we figure out how to move on together as a global community? And so this is an area that I personally would love to spend more time exploring, and an area really deserving of more attention.
Thank you for that. Just my closing remarks is that climate change is affecting everybody, the whole continent. So if one part of the globe is working on it and the other one is not, then we are not going to solve anything. We need to move together. So just my call is like, we need the support. We need support from developing countries, from wherever they can. Pick this baby up, because if you move forward and you leave this one behind, we are not going to meet our 2050 challenge. Thank you.
And with that final word on cooperation, we'll end this panel discussion.